Now before we get into tying our knots, I want to go over some vocabulary. For the purposes of our instruction, I'll be using this rope that has a blue section that's fused together with a red section. And I also have a green rope that I'll be tying the same knots to show you what it looks like when it's just tied on a standard climbing rope. But having these two colors will help us see what's going on inside of the knots as we tie them. Some of the words I'm going to use, I'm going to be talking about working end. This is the end of the rope that we'll be tying our knots on. And then we have the standing portion of the rope, which is the portion of the rope behind the knot that we'll be tying. We'll also talk about loops and bights. For our purposes, a loop is a section of rope that's crossed over itself and created a loop. I typically tie my loops with the working end behind the standing end. And then a bight of rope refers to a section of rope between the two ends. Again, for our purposes, a bight of rope will generally refer to an open loop like this that's drawn up in the center of the rope at some point. We will talk about setting knots, and when you set a knot, you effectively are pulling it closed. So I've tied my knot, but I have not set it yet. And as I set it, I'm drawing it closed. Dressing a knot can be referred to making sure it's nice and neat. And a good dressed knot is your goal because you don't want it to become untied while you're using it. It also makes inspection a lot easier. Another term we're going to use is the tail, and the tail refers to the remaining portion of the rope after you've tied your knot. We're going to be showing you a couple of different ways to tie knots because it's important to know how a knot should look when it's tied correctly, but it's also good to know when it's tied incorrectly. So some knots are pretty easy to determine if they've been tied incorrectly because they simply will come apart, but others are more subtle and may show some slight variations that are important to be aware of. It is not so important how you tie your knot. There's certainly lots of ways to tie the knots that we're going to be demonstrating. But knowing where you're going, knowing the benchmarks of a correctly tied knot are important so that you can inspect it and know that it's tied correctly. With that, let's get started. The figure 8 knot is often the first knot that climbers learn because it is the basis for the knot that you'll be tying yourself to the end of the climbing rope, the figure 8 follow through. It's also used as a stopper knot sometimes, and a variation called figure 8 on a bight is a nice way to get a loop that you can clip to in the middle of the rope. To tie the figure 8 knot, you'll make a loop. Bring the working end across the intersection of that loop, and then bring the end up through the loop. And what you end up with is a nice knot that is symmetrical, looks like the number 8. Very neat. But can be tied incorrectly in a number of ways. Oftentimes not enough crossings are made and you end up with an overhand knot, or perhaps you cross and go down through the loop instead, in which case you end up with this twisty, unnatural looking knot. So knowing what those incorrect versions look like is good, and practice will get you to a place where you can tie this one correctly every time. For the figure 8 follow through, I'm going to start my figure 8 about 3 feet from the working end of the rope. Then I'm going to pass the working end up through the tie-in points of my harness. And for the follow through, I'm basically going to retrace my strand of rope back through this knot. My goal is to end up with a nicely dressed knot that doesn't have any strands crossing over themselves. So I'm going to start on the outside edge of this strand. And I'm going to do whatever this original knot does, keeping my strands tucked nice and close to each other. Each time I'm going to pull the entire length of rope through. And then set the knot by grabbing the knot and pulling each strand separately. So like I mentioned, my goal is to not have any of the strands crossing over themselves as they retrace. I'm looking for 5 pairs of strands. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. For the follow through, I'm also trying to keep this knot within 6 inches of my harness so that the open loop behind it doesn't get caught on anything. And for the tail, I want to have at least 6 inches of tail remaining so it doesn't come untied by slipping back through the knot. If you have more than 6 inches, you can tie a finishing knot over the remaining portion of the rope, but it is not structurally necessary here at Linseth. Now let's take a look at a retrace that's not so clean. If I start on the inside for my retrace, wrap around, you can see the cross happening right there that I'm trying to avoid. And if I follow my knot incorrectly, I'll end up with this big gap here. Sometimes a small fix will be enough to correct it, but I still have that cross on the strands, which I'm not thrilled about. If I change sides though, I can fix that. But now my cross is down below. It is possible to get back to a place where the strands aren't crossing over each other. However you learn to tie this with the achieved result, though, that's the way you should stick with it. Alright, let's see this with the climbing rope now. So 3 feet of rope, make the figure 8, feed it up through my tie-in points, start on the outside, retrace the knot. Set the knot. Make sure it's nicely dressed with 6 inches of tail within 6 inches of my harness. And I'm ready to go. For the other variation, the figure 8 on a bight, we'll simply take a section of rope in the middle, bight, and we will tie the figure 8 knot using both strands as if they were one. And as I set it, I'm going to make sure the strands are tucked nice and neatly underneath each other. I can draw each strand nice and tight. I still have my 5 pairs. Looks like a number 8 doubled. And I've got this nice loop now that I can clip to. Let's see it on our green rope. Now, whether tied on a bight or as a follow-through on your harness, the figure 8 knot is a nice secure knot that won't come untied under load, but is relatively easy to untie. And if you have taken a fall and it's cinched up nice and tight, you can try to break the knot by bending it back and forth to loosen it, and then push the tail back up through the knot to untie it. Another foundation knot that's important for new climbers to know is the double overhand knot, also known as a barrel knot. And this is primarily used at the gym as a stopper knot below the belay device to keep the belayer from running out of rope at the end and having the rope go through the belay device, potentially dropping the climber. Outdoors, this is even more critical knot to have in your toolkit. When you're rappelling, you'll want to make sure to tie stopper knots on the ends of the rope that you're rappelling on so that you don't accidentally rappel off the ends of the rope, potentially falling to the ground and injuring yourself. To tie the stopper knot, you're going to make a loop and then make a second loop behind that around the standing end, and then bring the working end through those two loops. What I'm looking for is a nice little equal sign on one side and an X on the other. Equals X. The common mistake with the barrel knot is to make your second loop in front of the previous one. And when you pass your working end through, what you end up with is a less symmetrical knot where the equals isn't isolated and the X is kind of not really there. So be sure that your second loop crosses behind the previous one. Equals X. Another way that people tie this is over their palm. So you can wrap the rope over your palm, make that X now, and then pass the working end behind that X. The tricky part with this is that you have the pretty big loops, so as you're dressing the knot, make sure those loops don't cross over themselves. X equals. If I don't cross the loops here, or those loops flip over themselves, again, I end up with the incorrect version of this knot. The problem with this version is that under load, or under the right conditions, the knot has a tendency to roll over itself. And if it's not far enough away from the end of the rope, it could roll right off the end of the rope. So at Linseth, we recommend at least 6 inches of tail behind the knot, but 12 is even better. let's look at that on the green rope. And in this case, I'm actually going to pass it through my belay device and tie the stopper knot behind it. X equals. Another way to use the double overhand knot is to join two ends of rope together. Now, typically this is used on a single strand of rope that you want to turn into a loop, like a prusik loop or an improvised sling. But I'm going to use two different colored strands of rope here to demonstrate so you can see what's going on. So you'll take your two ends of rope and cross them over each other so they're pointing in different directions. Then, with your first strand, you're going to tie your double overhand knot around the other strand. And you get your nice X and equals. Now I'm going to do the same thing with the blue rope, but to make sure I end up with a consistent knot, I'm going to flip it around. Give myself plenty of rope to work with, and tie that second double overhand around the first strand. Got my X, my equals. Now for the last step, I'm going to take the two standing ends and I'm going to pull them apart from each other. And the knot will cinch up nice and snug. And you've got a really solid connection between those two ends. And if you leave that tied over time, that will become pretty fused together. But for a while at least, you can pull that apart and untie them if you need to. The reason I flip this around when I tie it is that if I try to tie it backwards, I can still make it work. But it's not how I'm used to tying it, and so it's not necessarily going to come out as neat. And when I pull them together, you can see I didn't quite get that right. I don't have a correct double overhand on this side. So, since I'm used to tying my knots a certain way, I just make sure I'm in position to do that. That's better. Draw together. Now, if you end up with too much tail coming out of one end of the knot, you can either retie it where you want it to be, or if you've got enough of a loop that you're happy with, you can always trim the rope and reseal it. You don't want to have too little tail though, for fear of it coming out of the knot altogether. This is also known as a double fisherman's knot. Alright, let's take a look at that double fisherman's knot now on a single strand of rope. This is a relatively short section of rope. Got my two ends pointing in different directions. Tie my first double overhand around one section, flip it around, give myself enough rope, tie my second double overhand around the other section of rope. Got a little sloppy there. Draw the two loops together. Now, I'm not particularly thrilled with the neatness of that knot. I'm going to back out and retie to make sure I get it right. That's better. And now I have a nice loop of rope.